I'm back. We are in the middle of this series called This Crazy Book, and we are wrestling with this crazy book. Now, maybe you, in one way, shape, or form, have sat down, however you've engaged with church your entire life. Maybe you sat down, you listened to somebody said, "Oh man, you gotta read this book," and so you're like, "All right, I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna sit down and read this book," and you go through it, and you're like, "I have no idea where this is going." This book is crazy. And whether that's a positive or negative statement, we've all at one point or another, whether we've come across a story within this book or something that is said, and we've said to ourselves, man, that is crazy. And so in 2015, we started this series. So if you just started coming recently, you think like, oh, well, everybody's in the middle of this series. And we decided we're going to sit down and we're going to work through the book of Acts together to be able to tackle this thing of like, how can we actually understand this crazy book? We're asking questions. We're trying to put things into context, and at times we're putting ourselves in the story, and we're seeing passages that we may have glimpsed over in the past. And so we're really being intentional in how we do it. And like I said, we're walking through the book of Acts, which is a book that was written to document, and the writer is the guy who wrote Luke. That is Luke. He wrote it to document with historical accuracy the beginning of this thing called the church. And so for the last couple of years, we've been walking through that, and we've been seeing how this message of Jesus Christ, which started in Jerusalem, then was taken off into the world and where we are today. So we're picking it up. We're starting in Acts chapter 9 today, and we've seen some incredible things happen at the beginning of the church. And I'll give you a Reader's Digest version to catch you up to where we are today, right? So Jesus Christ has gone through his ministry. He has been crucified. He's resurrected, and now he has gone and he's ascended, and he's given his followers a mission. He says, I want you to go and make disciples, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Do this in Judea, in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and bring it to the ends of the earth. And so they are doing that. And we saw in Jerusalem, right? We saw in Jerusalem that the church has already started to explode. 3,000, 5,000 people coming to know who Jesus Christ is in one day. And now we've already started to see how it's gone to move out. Last week we looked at the story of Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch, and we saw that because his life was changed, the church started to spread into Ethiopia, and the change that was made even then. See, the problem is that there's always an antagonist in these stories. And in this particular story, the antagonist is the religious leaders, these people that are trying to squelch this movement of Jesus Christ. They believe this is threatening to their way of life. The religious leaders were, back in the day, they had a lot of say in how things were run, and they always, put the law on people, and they wanted to squelch this thing of Jesus. And they thought, all right, you kill Jesus, you kill this movement. Right? But that's not what happened. You kill Jesus, Jesus resurrects, people see him, and the movement continues to go. In fact, the movement starts to flourish. So these religious leaders, it's making them even more and more angry, and they tried to squelch here in Jerusalem, and all of a sudden they find that this doesn't do anything but make the believers go out of Jerusalem and take the message elsewhere. And we were introduced to our character that we're talking about today. We're introduced to this person already in Acts chapter 7. And so often we glance over these introduction of characters sometimes because we're just reading through scriptures. Oh, I got to get through chapter 7. I got to get through chapter 8 today. But in chapter 7, we were introduced. That's the story of Stephen the martyr, first martyr of the church, who was stoned for his belief in Jesus Christ. But in that passage, there was one little verse that introduced us to our character today. So it's found in Acts 7, verse 58. And this little verse, it says, his accusers, and they're talking about Stephen. Stephen's accusers took off their coats and laid them at the feet of a young man named Saul. That's like in the movies when you see the main character for the first time, but you don't know it's the main character. You're like, oh, I'm going to watch that guy. That's what this is right now, okay? So this guy named Saul, he's watching the stoning of Stephen. He's a young man. He's a learned man. He's an educated human being who has been raised with some of the best religious teachers in the world. And he sees this stoning of Stephen. And he says to himself, yeah, that's what needs to happen to these followers of the way. And he gets really charged up. And all of a sudden, he begins to lead the charge in squelching this church in Jerusalem. We revisit it in chapter 8, verse 3. It says, but Saul was going everywhere to destroy the church. He went from house to house, dragging out both men and women who threw them into prison. I mean, these people were terrified of Saul. And I was talking to Justin who just did silence through us. He's one of our elders, and we were talking about that it's hard sometimes to communicate just how these guys were full of terror when it came to the name of Saul. Like think about the person that you are most terrified for, and even magnify that. I mean, these people were being terrorized. They were being ripped out of their homes because of what they believed. I was working to try to figure this out, and I was remembering a story of a friend of mine who I met through Liberty in North Korea, the organization that we partner with, or Link, and they work with helping North Korean refugees resettle and resettle either in the U.S. or in South Korea. And this one amazing young woman that I got to meet was telling us this story about how her and her family, when they were in North Korea, would have to hide while watching DVDs. Because as you can know, that North Korea is a closed country, and anything that came in was considered contraband. And if you were caught with something like a DVD, or if you were caught with something like a USB drive, and on these DVDs, there wasn't anything but South Korean dramas and American movies, right? Because the thought was, if I can get these into this country, people will start to know that there is a life outside of North Korea. But the problem is that this country is regulated, and the government says what you can and cannot do. And so if you are caught with one of these DVDs, if you are caught with one of these USB sticks, that you are literally forcefully dragged out of your house. You could be killed, to be made an example of. You could also be thrown into what are modern-day concentration camps. I mean, think about it. You are at home doing something that you and I do on a freely basis, whether it's worshiping God or whether it's watching a movie. And because of this, any moment, they could cut the power, they could break down the door, and they could see that you were watching something, or they could rip open your DVD player and see a movie, and you could be taken out. That's the kind of fear that some of these believers were living in when Saul would come door to door, ripping people out of their homes, persecuting them, and throwing them into the prison. That's the guy that we're dealing with here today. So we come back to his story at the top of Acts chapter 9, verse 1. It says, "Meanwhile, Saul was uttering threats with every breath and was eager to kill the Lord's followers. So he went to the high priest. He requested letters addressed to the synagogues in Damascus, asking for their cooperation in the arrest of any followers of the way he found there. He wanted to bring them, both men and women, back to Jerusalem in chains." So a couple of things to know about this passage: that he was so angry that this movement wasn't squelched in Jerusalem, that they were starting to go after, right? It's like when my mom used to get angry when she was angry at me and I'd run from her. She'd be like, "You better hope I don't catch up with you." Right? That's what's happening here. He is just getting so angry that these people are not listening to him, and he's just getting so angry that these people are still spreading the message of Jesus Christ, that now that it wasn't squelched here in Jerusalem, that it's going all over, that he's like, you know what? I'm going to take matters into my own hands. I'm going to go to the high priest, because back then the high priests were able, they had jurisdiction all over the place, and they were able to rule with the other synagogues that were in the neighboring towns, in the neighboring states. And so what happened was he went to the high priest and said, "Listen, I want to squelch this thing. I want to stop this thing. There's this synagogue in Damascus where there's a lot of followers of the way. They're meeting together. They're worshiping this Jesus guy. I want to take them all back to Jerusalem so that we can persecute them here, and we can throw them into prison, and we can stone them." And the high priest signs all these permission slips, if you will, and he goes and he gets out there and he bursts open the door, and he is ready. He takes his posse out, and he is going to go and take all of these followers that he can find in this road to Damascus. And this wasn't a little trip, right? We're talking, this was about 140 miles. That's the distance from here to Rhode Island, right? This is 140 miles that he was going to make the trek. Given the modes of transportation back in the day, this would have taken about 4 to 6 days to get there. But he was so determined to squelch this thing. He was so determined to make this thing stop that he was not going to stop at anything from bringing these people back to him. So he gathers these people. He's ready to go, and he starts his journey. And something incredible happens. Verse 3. "As he was approaching Damascus, on this mission, a light from heaven suddenly shone down around him. He fell to the ground, and he heard a voice saying to him, 'Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?'" I just love it how it puts it there, that he says he was on this mission, right? He was on his own mission, right? He was on this road. He was on his own mission. And so often, though, So often, though, it's when we're on our own mission and we're not paying any attention to God that God makes his mission known. One of the things that we've talked about in this crazy book is literally putting yourself into the story, right? Imagining what it would be like to be Saul on the road to Damascus. So think about this for a moment. You are so angry. You are so hurt. You are so sad. You are just fired up. You think about nothing else but seeing these people come to justice, or what you believe justice is, that you are ready to go, that you have your people that are ready to drag them home with you, and all of a sudden this light comes out of heaven so bright that it knocks you onto your feet. I mean, we have a hard time today when somebody knows our name, right? And we don't know them. Anthony, who are you? Right? I mean, it's one thing to be called by your name by somebody you don't know, but it's another thing when you are completely caught off guard. It said he literally fell to his knees, right? I mean, it would frighten him. I mean, the proper Greek translation of this would be that he freaked out. All right? He freaked out and hit the ground. I usually get here about 6:30 in the morning into this building when we open it up, right? And it's usually just me in the mornings while I'm opening up some doors and getting things ready, right? One particular Sunday, the janitor beat me here and I didn't know that he was here. And I was on the second floor where it was dark and I was getting ready to turn the line and he was like, "Hey, Anthony," and I screamed so loud that my pitch went way up. I think I scared him too. But that's the thing. It's like in the middle of nowhere. I was on my own mission. I was doing my own thing. He was like, "Hey," Anthony was like, "Ah!" And that was the end of it. But this was such a big deal. And remember, like I said, he was a religious guy. He knew the law. He knew what he believed that he was doing was right. And so he's not a dumb man, right? Exactly. And he's not a dumb man. He sits down and he says, "Who are you, Lord?" Somebody watching Netflix? We all good? Everything all right? What happened? All right. Anyway, continue if we can. So who are you, Lord? He asked that question. Who are you, Lord? Like I said, voice out of the sky, bright light, somebody who knows my name, got to be God. Got to be God. But he's got to be confused at this moment, right? Because he's thinking to himself, God's saying, "Why are you persecuting me?" He's got to be confused. Wait. I'm not persecuting you. I'm not persecuting a me. I'm persecuting an it. I'm persecuting a movement. I'm not persecuting you, God. I'm persecuting all these people who are saying the wrong things and are doing all the wrong things. I love the way that Saul tells his story again. See, it's such a momentous occasion, this particular story, the conversion of Saul, that it is actually retold in the book of Acts a number of times. And Saul actually gets a chance to tell his own story in Acts chapter 26 a little bit later on. And in Acts chapter 26, he recounts this particular moment this way. In Acts 26:14, it says, "We all fell to the ground, and I heard a voice saying to me in Aramaic, 'Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? It's hard for you to kick against the goads.'" That's what it says in NIV. In the New Living Translation, it says, "It's useless for you to fight against my will." But I love the way that it says this. It's hard for you to kick against the goads. This might be a moment where you have read this book and you're like, "I don't know what a goad is, so I'm going to keep going." But the most important thing about a goad, to understand what it is, it's actually a stick, right, with a blunt end, and then it's got a point on the other end. And what it was used for was for telling the ox who they were pulling the carts where to go, right? And so if the ox was going in the right direction, you just made sure to kind of goad it a little bit, right? But if it resisted, the thought was that it would kick back and it would hit the point, right? And so what God is saying here is that it's useless to fight against the goad. You know what else he's saying here? It's useless to fight against my nudges. And it's something I talk about all the time in terms of how God communicates with us, right? That he nudges us, that he uses the Holy Spirit to nudge us into things that he wants us to pay attention to, that he nudges us even in the ways that he wants us to go. And like I said, he was in a strict sect of religion. He believed what he was doing, what was right, and he was fighting God's nudges all along. Like he was seeing people changed. He was seeing these followers of Jesus, they were loving one another. They were taking care of one another. He saw all these things happen, but he chose to ignore it, and he was literally fighting against God in this moment. And like I said, as a Pharisee, he believed in the strictest laws. He believed that you had to observe it. They believed that God was a God of punishment, and they believed that they were better than absolutely everyone. And so you think about Saul for a moment, and maybe this is your story. Maybe this is part of your story. Maybe that you grew up to believe that this God was a God of punishment. That you grew up to believe that this was a God of anger. You grew up to believe that these people who called themselves Christ followers, and they were putting all these rules and they were putting all these regulations and they were saying all these things that didn't sound very Christ-like. They were saying that they were followers, and so it turned you off from the church for so long. Or maybe while you were growing up, you know, people were telling you this is how you need to view God. This is how God interacts with you, and that's how you grew up to believe who God was. This false image of who God was. I mean, that's my story. I was introduced, you know, I was introduced to God as a young age, and I was told by this teacher, right, who I trusted when I was in third grade, that God is almost like a Santa Claus in the sky. And maybe some of you have, you know, had this picture of God, right? That God is there, and he's just watching everything that we do, right? He's checking off all my goods, and he's checking off all my bads. And she told me, listen, every time you do something right, you receive something that's called a grace. And the more graces you receive, the closer to heaven you get. And so in third grade, I thought, okay, this is God. And I started to grow increasingly frustrated with this view of God because I started to get frustrated that I couldn't know. Right? There was no book to be able to check to see how I was doing, how my goods were outweighing my bads or my bads were outweighing my goods. This was before the internet, so I couldn't go check on a website or anything to see how I was doing. So I grew up with this view that God was this God who was just up there watching everything that I did and shaking his finger at me if I did something wrong and patting me on the back and saying, yeah, you're growing, you're getting better, you're growing closer to me when I did something right. And as I grew up, it started to frustrate me more and more and more. And truth be told, I started to not like God. I started to not like his people. And as I grew up, this would frame the way that I interacted with him. Before the time I got into high school and by the time I got into college, I really didn't pay much attention to God because I thought, well, if this is the way that God's going to interact with me, if this is the way that God's going to do this, then I just hope. I hope that by the time I get there that my goods have outweighed my bads. And I started to live for my own mission, and I started to live for my own beliefs, and I started to live for my own desires. And I think we've all been there before, where we've all lived for our own mission. I mean, Saul definitely was. Saul probably thought what happened on that road to Damascus, that the last thing that he would actually become one of the people that he was fighting against so hard. I think the last thing that anyone thought was that Saul would become one of them. I still, till this day, talk to friends who knew me back then. And they're like, oh, what are you doing? And I'm like, oh, I work for a church. And they're like, what, church is chicken? No, you don't. You do not. Really? You? No. You do not. Ask my mother. My mother, when they asked her, did you ever think your son was going to be a pastor? She laughed harder than I ever thought she was ever going to laugh in her life. She said, the closest I think my son is ever going to get to be a pastor is Tacos El Pastor. But it's amazing. It's amazing. And I think what we need to understand here is that this story can be any one of our stories. It's my story. I came into this relationship with Jesus Christ when I was in graduate school. I was going to the University of Alabama, Roll Tide, and I was as far from God as you could probably expect. I had no interest in pursuing God. I was on my own mission. I was living the way I wanted to live. I was smoking what I wanted to smoke. I was drinking what I wanted to drink. I was doing whatever I wanted to do because I was for sure on my own mission, and I wasn't giving any acknowledgement to God. But the crazy thing about this story of Saul, and the craziest thing about my story, and I'm sure a lot of you have the similar story, is that even if I wasn't pursuing God, God was pursuing me all over the place. And the thing I love about this particular story, especially the way that Saul recounts it later on in Acts 26, is that he says he spoke to me in a language that I could understand. And that's literally how God spoke to me, and how God brought me back to him, is he brought me back into a language that I could understand. And no, it wasn't a bright light from heaven, and that he wasn't calling my name, in the middle of a road, but I was actually sitting in my living room in Montgomery, Alabama, in my apartment, and I had fallen asleep on the couch. And I had woken up in the middle of the night, about 3 o'clock. I hadn't turned on, I had the television still on. And there was what I thought was a black and white movie, and I was too lazy to look for the remote, so I just sat there and watched. And what it turned out being a preacher. And he intrigued me because he was preaching at Madison Square Garden, and I had always had a fondness for New York City, and I was listening to what he was saying, and he started talking to me about grace. And he was talking to these people, and granted it was 1967 that he was talking to these people, but he didn't realize that in 2005 he was also talking to me. And God used this guy to tell me, listen, God doesn't sit there and count all your rights and wrongs against you, because when you put your faith in Jesus Christ, that it's the grace of God, that it is the blood of Jesus that makes you right with him, not anything that you can do, not anything that you will do, and not anything that you can do at all to earn God's favor. That when you walk into this relationship with Jesus Christ, you are made righteous because of Jesus Christ, not because of anything that you've done. And that grace isn't something that you can earn. That grace is something that is freely given. And it's not an individual thing. It is a covering. Grace is a covering and a gift from Jesus, and a gift from God for you to when you walk into this relationship with him. And I'm sitting there on my couch bawling, because at that moment I had my Damascus Road moment. Jesus met me right there, speaking a language that I was understanding, that I could get on, he was dispelling all of these rumors about who he was and who people said he was, but he was saying, no, Anthony, this is who I am, and this is who you need to understand that I am. And in the moment when that pastor did like the altar call and said, all right, if you're in Madison Square Garden, come down here, and I got out of that couch, I went straight to that television. And in that moment, I walked into this relationship with Jesus Christ, and I love, that it was that I wasn't, much like God said to Saul in that moment, Anthony, it's useless to fight against those goads. It is useless to resist me. You can fight all you want, but in the end, I'm going to win. And for some of you, that's where you are right now. For some of you, you find yourselves just having a conversation with a God that you don't even believe in. That you're having a conversation with this God who you think could never be relational to you. That there's this God that's up there that's judging and angry at you. But Saul's biggest problem wasn't God. Like I said, he believed in God. Saul's biggest problem was Jesus. He didn't believe that God could be that relational. So much so that what God told him, remember he says, who are you, Lord? Said Saul. And then it continues in verse 5, I am Jesus, the one you are persecuting. So it's like, wait a minute. So that guy was telling the truth? That this guy that I've been fighting against this whole time, that I was actually fighting against God. All this time I thought I was doing good. All this time I thought I was doing what I was supposed to do, and I was actually fighting against God. And listen, maybe that same question that Saul asked in the desert is the same question that you need to ask. Is that you need to understand and you need to believe. Do you believe that Jesus is who he says he is? Have you walked into this relationship with Jesus? Well, no, Anthony, but I am religious. Well, so was Saul. Well, no, Anthony, but I am spiritual. Well, so was Saul. See, Saul wasn't pursuing God. God was pursuing Saul, and he was making himself known over and over and over again. And I love how the verse continues, how the story continues. In verse 6, it says, "Now get up, go into the city, and you will be told what you must do." So think about this for a moment. Everyone knows that he's coming, right? Most likely somebody sent word that Saul of Tarsus was coming to persecute, to rip people out of their homes and to bring them back to Jerusalem to be able to persecute them. So rather than God saying, "No, turn around, go back to Jerusalem and think about what you've done," he said, "No, continue. I want you to get up and I want you to go." And it continues in verse 7. "So the men who were with Saul stood speechless, for they heard the sound of someone's voice, but saw no one. And so Saul picked himself up off the ground, and when he had opened his eyes, he was blind. So his companions led him by the hand to Damascus, and he remained there blind for 3 days and did not eat or drink." See, on the road to Damascus, it became relational for him. In that living room in Montgomery, Alabama, it became relational for me. And the most crazy thing about this story is that it later on goes to say that in Damascus, Saul was baptized. Think about that for a moment. You are terrified of this guy named Saul, and you're in Damascus, right? You are hiding in your homes, and you see Saul and all of his people coming in, and people are helping Saul walk, and you're kind of wondering, okay, Saul, what's going on with Saul? What is he doing? And you're waiting for Saul to strike, and then he gets baptized? That's crazy. That is crazy. Even more crazy, is that Saul was his Jewish name. Saul was his Hebrew name. His Roman name was Paul. And this is the same Paul who we now have cathedrals named after. This is the same Paul who we now have streets named after. This is the same Paul that some of you are named after. My middle name is Paul. Now you know. This is the same Paul who would go on to plant most of the churches, who would go on to write most of the New Testament. This message, this conversion, this moment is huge. I mean, this battle that's inside of you, if you don't know who Jesus Christ is, this battle that's happening in you right now is the same battle that Saul was facing. That this battle that's inside of you, what if it's a person? What if it's the Holy Spirit that is telling you that there is a God who loves you, that there is a God who wants to be so relational with you that he wants you to call him Father? And what if you walked just like Saul? You're on your own road to Damascus right now. And what if you prayed that same prayer that Saul did? What if you prayed that same prayer that the person that would become Paul? What if you said, "You know what, Lord? Who are you?" That you walked into this moment right now, that it's no mistake that you're here, that it's no mistake that you're watching on live stream, that it's no mistake that you're listening on the podcast because you've been fighting against the goad all along. But what if God is saying here that no matter what you've done, no matter where you've been, that no matter where you are, that there is a personal Damascus road for all of us, and I want to have that relationship with you. I want to make myself known to you, and I promise you, I am going to speak to you in a language that you are going to understand. Imagine that for a moment, that if you were standing outside the high priest's office, and you were standing across the street and you saw Saul walking out there with all those permission slips to take all of those people out there. If somebody came up to you and was like, "Hey, you see that guy over there? What are the odds that he is going to plant most of the churches? What are the odds that he's going to write most of the New Testament? What are the odds that he becomes one of the most renowned people to spread the message of Jesus Christ?" I guarantee you, people thought that Saul was the last person that Jesus was going to use. And I guarantee you that some of what Paul thought was the last thing that he was going to be used for. That I guarantee you that Paul thought, there's no way. No way. And some of you are in that boat right now. Some of you have walked into this relationship with Jesus Christ. You have said, "Yes, I believe that Jesus who is who he says he is," and yet You're sitting there and you're thinking to yourself, but I'm still not quote unquote good. That I still screw up. That I still make mistakes. And you believe that God is mad at you. You believe that God is angry at you. You've already walked into this relationship with you. I love what it says there, that it says that he got up and went. He didn't sit there and wallow in his past, and he didn't sit there and wallow in the things that he had done. No, he dusted himself off, he listened to God, and he got up and went. Some of you have had your experience on the road to Damascus, and you're still sitting there on the ground. Some of you have had this experience with Jesus Christ already, and you're still sitting on the ground, blinded by the light. What he's telling you right here at this moment is, dust yourself off. I'm ready to use you. I'm ready to use you right now. Some of you are sitting there right now, and what this is telling us is, listen, you need to understand that this Paul is the same person who persecuted Christians, who killed them, who did everything in their power to stop them, is the same Paul that would go on to serve them, to love them, to encourage them. This is the same Paul who tried to persecute Jesus, to push him away, that would come on to have such a connection with Jesus and such a personal intimacy with Jesus that he would then be able to write the rest of the New Testament. That's what he's calling you to do. This story today is so important to understand. We say it every Sunday, and it may go in one ear and may go out the other, but you have to understand that it is true that no matter where you are, that no matter what you've done, that no matter where you have been, that no one is beyond hope, no one is beyond the redemption, no one is beyond the reach of Jesus Christ. There are moments in our life where we're fighting against that goad, and we're fighting against what he wants to do in our life because of somebody who said this is how God is, or this is who God is supposed to be in your life. We're fighting against the goad because we don't like the way that somebody perceived him, or somebody the way presented to him. And God's saying, no. You just have to come to me. You have to ask that question. You have to be like Paul on the road to Damascus, down on your knees and say, who are you, Lord? If you've never walked into this relationship with Jesus, what better time to do that than now? What better time than to get on your knees? If you want, you can take that moment right now and just say, who are you, Lord? And if you've walked into this relationship with him, it's a great time to be able to revisit that. To understand that there is nothing that can separate you from the love of Jesus Christ. So no matter where you are on that spectrum, know that he's ready. He's ready for that personal relationship with you. He's ready to use you. To use you to be able to take his message to others, to change their lives. That's the story. That's the story, and it will be revisited over and over and over again because Paul cannot stop telling people what has happened. Hey, you knew who I was, but that's no longer who I am anymore. This is who I am because of who Jesus Christ is. And that's what we're invited into. So right now, if there's a God that wants to have this relationship with you, maybe that's the prayer we pray right now. Who are you, Lord? And if there's a God that wants to be that relational with you, that wants to make himself known to you, that we'll pray that right now and see where he's going to take us. Will you pray with me? Father, there are people all along the spectrum right now that are listening to this message, that are listening to this passage, and they believe a couple of things. One, they believe they're beyond redemption. They believe because of the choices that they've made, the things that they've done, or the things that they're doing, that they're beyond your reach. They also believe that they can never be good enough to be in your presence. Father, I know because I lived there. I lived there for a number of years. I believed I wasn't good enough. I believed I believe so many wrong things about you for so long. And my heart just hurts. It just hurts because there are people here today that have the wrong picture of you. My prayer is for them today, God, that they will understand that that you are a relational God, that you are a God who has come to them and are speaking a language that they can understand. To know that no matter where they are, no matter what they've done, no matter where they've been, that you are calling them into this relationship. And my prayer is also for those of us who have walked into this relationship with you, who find ourselves stumbling, who find ourselves making mistakes, who find ourselves missing the mark sometimes, and we struggle with the belief that because we do that, that we fall out of your favor. But that couldn't be farther from the truth. That like Saul, that we are down on our knees, that you're saying, hey, I haven't gone anywhere. Get up, dust yourself off, and continue the mission. And that's where we are, God. I pray that we are there, that we understand that you can use us and that you will use us despite what we've done. And Father, we can't wait to see how. And it's in your Son's name we pray.